Angkor Wat is 162 hectares, visible from 30 kilometers, and somehow it was lost for centuries. In 1860, a French naturalist named Henri Mouhot supposedly wandered through the jungle and accidentally discovered the largest religious monument ever built. The world celebrated, books were written, but the evidence tells a very different story. I looked at the map. The story fell apart in seconds. Here is the first thing worth thinking about. Angkor Wat Central Tower rises 65 meters above a dead flat tropical plain. The elevation around it is only 10 to 30 meters above sea level. There are no mountains, no hills, nothing obstructing the view. Basic line-of-sight calculations show this tower is visible from approximately 30 kilometers away. Let me put that in perspective. 30 kilometers. That is roughly the distance from downtown Manhattan to the edge of Long Island, from central London to Heathrow Airport. You could see this thing from a day's walk away, even accounting for jungle canopy and atmospheric haze. Any fisherman climbing onto his roof would spot it immediately. Stay with me here because the numbers only get more absurd. Angkor Wat is only 16 kilometers from the shore of Tonle Sap, Southeast Asia's largest freshwater lake. During the rainy season, the lake swells so dramatically that the distance shrinks to just 8 kilometers. This lake has been a center of human settlement, fishing, and trade for as long as anyone can remember. Think about what 16 kilometers means in human terms. That is 3 hours of walking at a relaxed pace along a forest path. You cannot have a populated lake shore and a lost city 3 hours away. It does not work. But it is not just the temple. Surrounding Angkor Wat is a colossal water management system. 2 artificial reservoirs, the Western Barai and the Eastern Barai, each roughly 8 kilometers by 2 kilometers, plus at least 6 more artificial lakes and a network of canals. These are visible from space. They hold millions of cubic meters of water. The Western Barai alone covers 15 square kilometers. For reference, that is larger than many modern cities. You are asking me to believe that fishermen on the largest lake in Southeast Asia somehow never noticed an 8-kilometer-long artificial lake right next door, that traders on the Mekong and Tonlep rivers never looked to the north. Now here is where the official story starts to completely unravel. Humans have always settled near water. It is one of the most basic facts of civilization. The Mekong River, one of the world's great waterways, flows through this region. The Tonle Sap River connects the lake to the Mekong. Phnom Penh, the capital of Cambodia, sits at their confluence. Every major settlement in the Khmer world was built along these water routes. And there, right in the middle of this network, sitting on the shore of the region's largest lake, surrounded by artificial reservoirs the size of small seas, stands a temple complex covering 162 hectares. The official story asks you to believe it was forgotten for centuries. The standard defense goes like this. Angkor was not truly lost, they say, because Buddhist monks lived there continuously. Alright, let us examine that claim. Buddhist monks are among the most disciplined people on earth. They maintain strict hierarchies, observe rigorous routines, and keep their sacred spaces immaculate. That is what monks do. But when the French arrived, they found massive trees growing directly out of the walls, roots splitting stone blocks apart, roofing tiles falling off, statues cracked, broken, some missing their heads entirely. Snakes had colonized entire chambers. Does that sound like a place where monks lived for 400 years? And this is not speculation. These are the French expedition's own photographs. Compare Angkor to any functioning Buddhist temple anywhere in Asia. You will find swept floors, trimmed gardens, repaired walls, polished statues. Monks instinctively maintain their environment. The idea that generations of monks sat in crumbling ruins for 4 centuries and never once picked up a broom does not hold together. They were not there. Even Mouhot himself, in his earlier writings, acknowledged that Europeans had visited the complex before him. He mentions Charles-Émile Boerlevaux, a French missionary who had been there years earlier. So Mouhot did not stumble upon anything by accident. He went there deliberately. The accidental discovery story was constructed after the fact. This is not fringe thinking. Mainstream historians at the École Française d'Extrême Orient, the institution that has led Angkor research since 1898, openly acknowledge that Mouhot was not the first European there. Scholars like Michael Coe of Yale and David Chandler have documented extensive pre-Mouhot contact. The discovery myth persists in popular culture, not in serious scholarship. And Mouhot was hardly the first outsider to document Angkor. Chinese diplomats described it in detail in the 13th century. Zhou Daguan visited in 1296 and wrote an extensive account of daily life there. Japanese pilgrims drew maps of the complex in the 17th century. Portuguese traders visited in the 16th century. The site was continuously known to the outside world. So if everyone already knew it was there, why invent a discovery? Let us keep going. So we have Chinese records, Japanese maps, Portuguese accounts, and a French missionary who visited before Mouhot. We have the largest lake in Southeast Asia 8 kilometers away. We have a tower visible from 30 kilometers. And somehow an entire civilization forgot this place existed. The question is no longer whether the discovery story is true. The question is why it was invented. But before we get to the why, let us look at the what. Because the physical reality of Angkor Wat is just as surprising as the story they built around it. This is not some crude pile of rocks. The engineering here is extraordinary, and it raises serious questions. The temple was built primarily from two materials. The structural core uses laterite, a porous iron-rich stone that is light but strong, perfect for load-bearing walls. The exterior uses sandstone from alluvial deposits, softer and ideal for carving. The builders understood material science. They used the right stone for each specific purpose, exactly the way a modern engineer would. Now look at the joints. The stone blocks are fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade between them. In many places, you cannot even see the seam. This is not unique to one wall or one section. It is consistent across the entire complex, over 162 hectares. That level of precision at that scale is remarkable. But the carvings are where it gets truly strange. Angkor Wat contains some of the most intricate stone carvings ever created. Thousands of square meters of detailed narrative scenes, celestial dances, mythological battles, all carved into sandstone with astonishing finesse. Some details are barely a millimeter across. Connecting bridges between carved elements are thinner than a pencil lead. One researcher discovered an unfinished section of wall that reveals the construction process. First, the rough stone was placed. Then something removed a uniform layer of material to a precise depth, about 10 to 15 centimeters. Then, in what appears to be the same pass, an ornamental pattern was carved. One pass, rough to finished. Over a meter of height, no human hand works that way. The two marks tell a story that does not match any known hand-carving technique. The cutting pattern is diamond-shaped, consistent, and repeating. It suggests a mechanical device approximately 1.5 meters tall and 70 centimeters wide that moved along the wall, performing multiple operations simultaneously. Material removal, depth setting, and ornamental carving, all in one continuous pass. At one corner of the unfinished wall, there is a telltale error. Where the mechanism turned from one wall face to another, the entire ornamental pattern shifted down by about 10 centimeters, but only the upper portion shifted. The bottom line stayed perfectly aligned. This means the cutting mechanism had independently adjustable segments, each requiring separate calibration. After that corner, the cutting quality deteriorates rapidly. The lines wobble. The depth becomes inconsistent. Then the mechanism simply stopped and never started again. The mark suggests the cutting head was drifting away from the wall, losing focus until it just powered down. Someone was operating this equipment, and then they were not. Think about what that means. Something interrupted this mid-construction, permanently. One wall shows what appears to be a shadow of the device itself, preserved in differential weathering. Where the device was pressed against the stone for years, the surface stayed its original yellowish color. Everything around it darkened with time. It is essentially a photograph of the tool burned into stone by decades of exposure difference. The construction was not done by primitive laborers using copper chisels and bamboo scaffolding, as the simplified version claims. It was done by workers operating advanced equipment they did not fully understand. Like a construction crew today using a CNC router, they can operate it, but they did not design it, and they cannot repair it when it breaks. And here's evidence that the operators were skilled, but not the designers. The main architect clearly understood architecture beautifully, but used standard brick-style block laying rather than true polygonal masonry, real polygonal construction like we see in Peru and elsewhere, lock stones along all three axes for earthquake resistance. Angkor's builder knew architecture, but did not know the deeper science behind it. That design choice had consequences. When something catastrophic hit this region, the blocks that were perfectly fitted but only locked in one axis simply slid apart. Some walls collapsed completely, while neighboring identical structures remained standing. That is not what happens with normal decay. That is the fingerprint of a seismic event. But wait, Cambodia does not get major earthquakes, so what caused this? Here is the paradox. Cambodia sits in the middle of the Eurasian plate, surrounded by seismic zones but itself geologically quiet. The Philippine plate pushes from one side, the Indian plate from the other, but the quakes happen at their boundaries hundreds of kilometers away. Cambodia does not get earthquakes strong enough to topple a megalithic temple, at least not from normal tectonic activity. The distraction pattern at Angkor tells us something specific. One structure is devastated, but the one right next to it is untouched. This is exactly what wave mechanics predicts. When a shockwave passes through a solid medium, it creates interference patterns, zones of maximum energy and zones of zero energy, alternating. There is an even more revealing piece of evidence. The Western Baray and Eastern Baray were clearly engineered as a connected water system with canals between them. Water seeks its own level. Any competent engineer knows this. But today the floor of the Eastern Baray sits 10 meters higher than the Western. At a designed water depth of only 5 meters, the Eastern Baray can never fill. The system is broken. The only explanation is that the entire tectonic plate tilted by approximately 0.3 degrees fast. Something hit the Earth's crust near Cambodia with enough force to lift one side of a continental plate. And when you trace the tilt direction, it points directly toward the South China Sea, between the Spratly and Paracel Islands. And in that exact direction, we find some of the most powerful volcanoes on Earth. In Indonesia, we find a chain of supervolcanoes, Toba, Tambora, Krakatoa, each one powerful enough to reshape continents. Tambora erupted in 1815 with such force that it caused 3 years without summer across the entire planet. 71,000 people dead. An entire language, the Tamboran, wiped from existence. An above-ground eruption creates a shock wave through the air, but it also sends a shock wave through the lithosphere, the solid rock of the Earth's crust. That subsurface wave would have radiated outward from Indonesia, directly toward Cambodia, roughly 1,000 kilometers away. Enough distance for the wave to develop interference patterns. Enough energy to tilt a tectonic plate and shake apart a stone temple. So what do we actually know? Angkor was being actively constructed when a catastrophic event struck. The builders were mid-project, equipment was running, workers were operating. Then something happened. The operators fled. The equipment stopped. Nobody came back for decades. The jungle moved in. Now the story takes a completely different turn. Look at the symbols. The entire complex is saturated with one recurring image, the Naga, a multi-headed serpent that appears on balustrades, doorways, lintels, and in freestanding sculptures throughout Angkor. Officially, it is a mythological symbol, but what if it is something else entirely? The Naga serpent appears not just at Angkor but across all of Southeast Asia, India, China, Mesoamerica, and the ancient Mediterranean. The feathered serpent, Quetzalcoatl, the Chinese dragon, the Greek Hydra, the Hindu Shesha, all multi-headed or multi-bodied serpentine beings associated with creation, water, and advanced knowledge. The same image, the same associations, separated by oceans. At Angkor, the Naga is not just decorative. Every major causeway is lined with figures pulling on the body of a giant Naga in what is called the churning of the ocean of milk. The official interpretation is mythology. But look at the scene literally. Rows of figures operating a long device, something that moves back and forth, something that produces results from raw material. Remember the diamond-shaped cutting pattern left by the unknown device? And the shadow on the wall, roughly 1.5 meters tall, with a curved upper portion and a flat operational face? Now look at the bas reliefs of figures riding nagas, a person sitting behind a curved multi-headed form operating it. The silhouette matches. Mythology or user manual, you decide. But let me show you one more thing. Consider the Medusa myth from Greece, a being whose gaze turned living things into stone. Perseus had to cut off its head to stop it, but the head kept working for a while even after severing. Now replace the myth with a device, a mechanism that scans objects and reproduces them in stone. Cut off the operational head and it still processes its last scan. It is not mythology. It is user experience described by people who did not understand the technology. Now let us talk about what happened 70 years after the supposed discovery. In 1931, Paris hosted the International Colonial Exhibition. The French decided to build a full-scale replica of Angkor Wat's central temple. Not a small model, the actual thing, 5,000 square meters, and they built it entirely from concrete, gypsum, and sand. In 6 years. 6 years. Architects Blanche and Charles Lacasse surveyed the original, then built a faithful copy using casting and molding techniques. This demolishes the argument that such structures cannot be built with casting technology. They literally did it in Paris in the 1930s with period materials. Here is a fascinating detail. Britain, the world's largest colonial power at the time, refused to attend the colonial exhibition. The greatest empire on earth boycotted the event. Why? Some historians suggest the dispute was specifically about Angkor Wat, about who controlled the narrative, about who owned the credit. Colonial rivalry over a temple, or rivalry over something underneath it? Mouhot's expedition was actually funded by Britain. The Royal Geographical Society sponsored his travels. He operated under British patronage. But after his death in 1861, the colonial administration of Cambodia passed to France. What had been a British-sponsored expedition became a French possession. The replica in Paris was not just an exhibition, it was a power statement. Let us look at the man himself. Henri Mouhot, born in France, supposedly so brilliant that he was teaching French and Greek at the Russian military academy in St. Petersburg by age 18. Then he married, went to Cambodia, and conveniently died there at 35. His books were published posthumously. A dead man cannot be cross-examined. A dead man's notes can say whatever the publisher wants them to say. To be fair, mainstream archaeology has made extraordinary progress at Angkor. In 2012, Damian and the team from the University of Sydney used airborne LiDAR to reveal an entire hidden city beneath the jungle canopy, confirming Angkor as one of the largest pre-industrial urban centers ever found. UNESCO has protected the site since 1992. The real science happening here is remarkable. The question is what the popular narrative around the discovery obscures. Now let us go back to the water. The Western Barai alone required excavating roughly 80 million cubic meters of earth. The Eastern Barai, another 46 million. The Northern Barai and all the canals add at least 30 million more. In total, about 140 million cubic meters of earth were moved. Where did it all go? Simple math actually gives us the answer. On a flat plain, excavated earth becomes hills. 3 hills near the complex, each crowned with a temple, contain almost exactly the right volume. Mount Krom on the lakeshore holds about 30 million cubic meters. Homombok near the eastern Barai holds roughly 107 million. A third hill near a laterite quarry holds about 5 million. Total 142 million. The missing earth is sitting right there. The reservoir served a dual purpose. They provided water for the complex and surrounding agriculture, but they were also quarries. The builders extracted laterite and sandstone blocks from older structures buried beneath the surface, structures that now peek out from the bottom of the dried-up barrays. Angkor was built partly from the bones of something even older, buried underneath it. When the Western Barray's water level drops, you can see them. Walls, foundations, the remnants of structures far older than anything on the surface, covered in silt and clay, half dissolved but unmistakable. The current Angkor Wat is built on top of something. Something that was genuinely ancient. Something that was buried. The question is, buried by what? Across the planet from Rome to St. Petersburg to Prague, we find first floors buried under meters of sediment, buildings sunk into the ground, cities with mysterious underground levels that were once street level. The pattern is global. Something deposited enormous quantities of material on top of existing civilization everywhere, all at once. But here is the key detail that separates Angkor from the rest. The main temple towers rise 65 meters. If the site had been buried in the same event that buried cities worldwide, the entire complex would be underground. But it is not. Only small amounts of sand and debris appear in isolated pockets, rarely more than a meter deep. This suggests Angkor was built after the burial event, using materials extracted from the buried layer beneath it. The light sand deposits that do exist at Angkor have a different explanation. When the catastrophe hit, the sandstone cladding would have shattered. Sandstone develops a hard exterior shell over time, like armor, but inside it remains soft and crumbly. Violent seismic vibration would crack that shell, and the soft interior would spill out like sand from a broken hourglass. Look at the temple of Beng Mialia, about 40 kilometers from the main complex. Unlike Angkor Wat, it was left largely unrestored. The destruction is spectacular and revealing. Entire corridors filled with tumbled blocks, but the blocks themselves are mostly intact. They did not crack from impact. They separated at their joints and scattered, exactly what seismic displacement looks like. Now zoom out, way out. Look at the big picture. The geography tells the same story from a different angle. Cambodia today is surprisingly poor for a country with fertile land, abundant water, a long growing season, and only 17 million people. It has everything a civilization needs to thrive. The land produces rice, sugarcane, rubber, citrus, cotton, and supports abundant livestock and fisheries. So why the poverty? Something reset this region, the same way something reset Indonesia, which lies devastated just to the south. To the east of the impact zone, Australia's interior, 1,000 kilometers of lifeless desert. To the west, Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, recently repopulated and still recovering. The destruction corridor is visible on any satellite image if you know what to look for. Let us pull all of this together. We have a temple complex that was never lost, built with technology that raises hard questions, partially destroyed by a catastrophe that the official record ignores, sitting on top of something much older. next to a water system that proves the ground shifted, covered in images of serpent devices, and wrapped in a false discovery narrative created by competing colonial powers. So, what is actually under Angkor Wat? That is the real question. The surface temple may be only a few hundred years old, but the structures visible in the dried up reservoirs are something else entirely. They use different construction methods. They sit at a different ground level. They were buried, not abandoned. And the entire visible complex may have been built specifically to sit on top of them. This changes everything about the discovery narrative. You do not fabricate a story about finding a lost temple if the temple is just a temple. You fabricate the story because the temple is hiding something. Colonial powers were not competing over a pile of old rocks, they were competing over what is underneath them. Parts of the complex remain restricted to this day. Officially, this is because of unexploded ordnance from the Vietnamese-Cambodian conflict of the 1970s, a war that gave cover to restrict access, attribute existing damage to modern artillery, and keep certain areas permanently off limits. And the modern handling of Angkor follows a familiar pattern seen at controversial archaeological sites worldwide: restricted areas, official narratives that do not match the physical evidence, dating methods that rely on circular reasoning, technologies attributed to primitive tools that cannot replicate the results. Let me be specific about the dating problem. The standard chronology places Angkor Wat's construction in the 12th century, commissioned by King Suryavarman II. This dating relies almost entirely on inscriptions and chronicles, stone inscriptions that could have been carved at any time, chronicles that were written, copied, and rewritten over centuries by people with obvious political motivations. No reliable independent dating method has been applied to the core stone construction of Angkor Wat. Carbon dating works on organic material, not stone. Thermoluminescence dating has enormous error margins, and stratigraphic dating relies on comparing layers to other layers whose dates were also assigned by comparison. It is circular. So what does the physical evidence actually suggest? The construction was interrupted by a catastrophe. The equipment was abandoned mid-operation. The sandstone cladding shows weathering patterns consistent with roughly 2 to 3 centuries of tropical exposure, not 800 years. Everything points to a much more recent origin than the official dates. The massive trees growing through the temples are perhaps the most photographed feature of the complex. Tapram, the so-called Tomb Raider temple, is famous for its strangler figs consuming entire buildings. But these trees are not thousands of years old. The largest specimens are consistent with 2 to 300 years of growth. They started growing in the ruins, not before them. Now zoom out one final time. I want you to see the complete picture. This is Angkor from space. A geometric pattern of reservoirs, canals, temples, and roads covering over 1,000 square kilometers. It is one of the largest pre-industrial settlements ever mapped. Modern LiDAR surveys have revealed roads, residential zones, and agricultural infrastructure extending for dozens of kilometers in every direction. At its peak, this was one of the most extensive urban landscapes in human history, and someone lost it. Remember, this is next to the largest lake in Southeast Asia, on major river trade routes, in a flat plain where the main tower is visible from 30 kilometers, with reservoirs the size of small seas. And the story we are supposed to accept is that a French naturalist accidentally found it while wandering through the jungle in 1860. So let me summarize what the evidence actually shows. 1. The complex was built no earlier than 300 years ago, based on weathering, vegetation growth, and the absence of global burial deposits. 2. Advanced mechanical equipment was used, equipment that the operators did not design and could not repair. 3. Construction was interrupted by a catastrophic seismic event likely connected to volcanic activity in Indonesia. 4. The site was built on top of something much older, structures visible in the dried-up reservoirs. 5. The discovery narrative was fabricated by competing colonial powers fighting over control of the site and whatever it conceals. 6. The Naga imagery that dominates the complex may represent the actual technology used in construction, preserved as religious symbolism by people who saw it but did not understand it. The pattern at Angkor is not unique. It repeats at Giza, at Sacsayhuaman, at Göbekli Tepe, at Teotihuacan. Advanced construction, remarkable precision, official timelines that do not match the physical evidence, discovery narratives that fall apart under scrutiny, and always restricted areas that the public cannot access. Angkor Wat is not a mystery of the past, it is an open question of the present. Someone decided we should not ask why a bumbling French explorer stumbling upon a lost city in the jungle would be more useful than the truth, more controllable, more convenient. The next time someone tells you Angkor Wat was lost in the jungle, ask them one simple question. Lost to whom? Not to the fishermen on Tonle Sap, not to the traders on the Mekong, not to the traders on the Mekong, not to the Chinese diplomats or the Japanese pilgrims or the Portuguese merchants. It was only ever lost in the story they chose to tell. 162 hectares, 65 meters tall, visible from 30 kilometers, next to the largest lake in Southeast Asia, surrounded by artificial reservoirs the size of small seas. Documented by Chinese, Japanese, and Portuguese visitors for centuries, and they told you it was lost. They told you a Frenchman found it by accident. They told you, and for 160 years almost everyone believed it. The real discovery at Angkor Wat is not the temple, it is the question. And once you see it here, you start seeing it everywhere, at every ancient site where the official story does not match the stones, where the timeline does not match the technology, where the narrative exists not to explain the past, but to prevent you from asking the right questions about it. Angkor Wat was never lost, but the truth